Today we focus on national reporting with respect to human rights practices. Here's an overview of what we'll discuss. We'll focus on the country reports prepared by the U.S. Department of State each year. We'll talk about the content of the report, in particular the 2013 report that was released in February of this year, 2014. We'll focus on how the reports are prepared, some benefits and critiques of the reporting process, and the counter-report prepared by China that critiques the United States' own human rights practices. We'll conclude the lecture with a brief evaluation of the pros and cons of national reporting. Let's start with a brief overview of the country reporting process as it occurs in the United States, which is the leading country that reports each year on human rights practices around the world. This has been in place since the mid-1970s, and the State Department gathers an enormous amount of material together and submits it to the U.S. Congress, assessing the status of internationally recognized human rights in all UN member states. And the reports provide a quite unique annual snapshot of human rights conditions and positive and negative trends around the world. The publication of the report is a substantial media event, and countries with poor human rights records often try to justify or explain why they have been reported on unfavorably by the United States. And there is also criticism occasionally of the United States for publishing these reports. Let me show you now some of the highlights of the 2013 report. The report refers to developments in 5 key areas: a continuing crackdown by governments on civil societies and NGOs. This is a restriction and violation on freedom of association and assembly. Growing restrictions on press freedoms and freedom of expression. A lack of accountability for security forces and the abuses that they perpetrate. A lack of effective labor rights protections, both with respect to union organizing and otherwise, and a marginalization of a variety of different vulnerable groups, including religious and ethnic minorities, women and children, LGBT persons and communities, and individuals with disabilities. This is just a broad overview of key trends. The human rights situation in specific countries may be quite different. Before asking you to consider one or more countries in the report, I want to focus for a moment on how country reports are prepared. Here you see a statement from the preface to the State Department's report, which describes how the information is gathered. In particular, you see that information is gathered from a variety of sources, both governmental and non-governmental, judges, journalists, academics, activists, etc. Then the information is corroborated and analyzed and edited, drawing on additional sources in order to determine how reliable the overall picture of human rights practices are in a particular country. And the key guiding principle here I've highlighted in blue, that all information be reported objectively, thoroughly, and fairly. To see whether that's in fact the case based on your own experience or the experience that you have heard about from others, I invite you now to go to the State Department's website and pick a country, whether your own country or another country or a pair of countries, review the State Department's report for 2013 for that country, and then continue the lecture. Now that you've had a chance to take a look at one or more country reports in the State Department's overall report for 2013, let's consider some of the benefits and risks of the reporting process. So there are a number of benefits that I think should be apparent to you right off the bat. First, having this sort of document with all the detail it contains provides a factual basis for U.S. lawmakers to fashion the U.S.'s external human rights policies, including aid and sanctions that we'll discuss in the next lecture. Another benefit of state reporting is that it serves as a core reference document for other actors, international organizations, civil society groups, other governments, and scholars, and indeed the State Department country reports are incorporated into various indices or measures of human rights violations around the world. And this year-by-year snapshot over the last 30 years or so makes it possible to assess widespread trends in different countries, in different regions, and globally. A third benefit concerns raising public awareness about human rights issues and violations. Instead of abstract or general information, you can go online to the web and see for any given country in any given year what its human rights practices are as determined by the sources that were referenced in a previous slide. Finally, the state reporting process can provide a counterweight to positive claims about human rights practices by repressive governments, positive claims that don't have as much of a basis, or indeed any basis, in objective fact. Let's then turn to some of the critiques that have been leveled at the reporting process. These are critiques that other governments have made, critiques that some civil society groups may have made, and that scholars may have made. So let me list them for you. First, the reports, and this is in fact true, omit economic and social rights. The U.S. only reports on civil and political rights. That's a determination it's made in part because the United States has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and because the status of economic, social, and cultural rights in the U.S. legal system is somewhat more equivocal. So that is, I think, a legitimate criticism. A second criticism is that the U.S. allegedly reviews the human rights practices of its allies and those with whom it has strategic interests more leniently. That is to say, if you were to compare the situation in a U.S. ally versus a country that was non-aligned or indeed in some political tension with the United States, then you might see a difference in conduct. So the allegation goes. A third charge is that some rights are interpreted in the State Department reports in ways that diverge from international standards. As we have discussed, states, including the United States, have filed reservations to some human rights treaties, and the United States does tend to report on international standards as it has understood them through its reservations and understandings. Another criticism is that U.S. reports are, at least as of today, no longer needed because we have such a large variety of international reporting mechanisms. This criticism is especially pronounced after 2006 with the rise of the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, process. Now that countries are reviewed all the time by the UN Human Rights Council, this argument goes, there's really no need for national reporting such as the State Department's country reports. A final critique concerns the fact that the United States does not report on its own human rights standards. That is in fact true, with the exception of a number of specialized areas, most notably trafficking in persons, where the United States does report on its own human rights progress. The State Department's response to this criticism is that self-reporting would be not very credible. And so the United States is content to be reviewed in the Universal Periodic Review process and participates in that process and considers that to be a superior approach to self-reporting. Now, as you might imagine, a number of other countries, particularly countries that are criticized by the United States in its annual reports on human rights, are quite critical of this U.S. reporting process. And the most critical country, by far, and the most vociferous in its criticism, is China. And here you see China's counter-report called the Human Rights Record of the United States in 2013. Since the late 1990s, China has issued these reports within a day or two after the U.S. issues its own report. And here you see some of the critiques of human rights shortcomings in the United States. The spying through electronic surveillance, U.S. drone strikes that have resulted in civilian casualties, the United States' failure to ratify several core human rights agreements, the large number of individuals in solitary confinement in U.S. prisons, and the fact that gun violence in the United States leads to more than 10,000 deaths each year. So here you see, if you will, a kind of tit for tat. China responds to the U.S. criticism of China with its own criticism of the United States. I'd like to conclude the lecture with a brief discussion of the pros and cons of the national reporting process. You've seen some of the benefits of human rights reports as well as some of the critiques, and I think whether the benefits on balance outweigh the costs depends on a number of factors. For example, are international review processes such as UPR an adequate substitute for national reporting? It's worth noting that the UPR process is much more recent than the State Department's country reports, and so at the time those reports were initiated, they were the only global record of human rights compliance around the world. That has changed over time as more and more states have come to ratify human rights treaties, and now as all UN member states participate in the UPR process. On the other hand, the United States adheres to very strict evidentiary standards in trying to corroborate and determine the veracity of the allegations that it receives with respect to each country. Hundreds of individuals around the world each year participate in this process by contacting many of the sources that you saw in the previous slide. So this is quite a unique and fact-specific record of how human rights are actually being experienced and realized in individual countries. And it might provide a counterweight to a UPR process in which peer review might result in conclusions that are weaker than the United States might make with respect to human rights violations. That said, to the extent that the United States does not report on all human rights violations, not economic, social, and cultural rights, and to the extent that, at least in some areas, international standards deviate from or may be higher than national standards, that can be potentially problematic. I'll leave you with some additional sources that describe the U.S. reporting process, China's counter-reporting with respect to the U.S., as well as more general criticisms and praise for both processes.